the grave isn't silent. Some dare to break its final peace, whispering names the soil meant to keep, until the dead answer with a terrible sound. If you too answer with a terrible sound, check out Pantheon Apparel, a clothing brand inspired by myths, legends and folklore. We ship worldwide and are rated excellent on Trustpilot. Link in the description. Necromancy is the art of raising and commanding the dead, reaching across the veil and forcing an answer. Sometimes it meant summoning spirits for knowledge that only the departed could give. Sometimes it meant bending the dead into service, raising bodies to fight, or binding them to objects and places. Death is supposed to be the one boundary no living soul can breach. To call the dead back is to strip silence from the grave and invite forces that cannot be dismissed. Kings outlawed it, priests condemned it, yet it never disappeared. It begins in Mesopotamia. The earth wasn't still, it pulsed with the forces of the dead. To reach them, the living cut pits into the soil, holes in the world, and poured in food, beer, milk, and blood to summon the dead. They were commands, and when the dead rose, they became hungry, restless, dangerous. You didn't ask questions without offering something back. Those who disturbed the grave too often found it followed them home. In Egypt, death was wrapped in ritual, but power still clung to the tomb. Anubis, jackal-headed god of embalming, stood guard at the threshold between the worlds, weighing the hearts of the dead against the feather of truth. But some priests tried to speak to the soul as well as guide it, to draw wisdom from the other side. Spells carved into stone and papyrus were for the dead's journey, but some were instructions calling them back. The Book of the Dead. It warns. The tomb was a chamber of passage, but also of power, and anything pulled from it came with a cost. In Greece, Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus carves a pit, pours milk, honey, wine, and blood. Blood always opens the door. The dead rise in a frenzy, clawing for it, pressing around him, desperate for taste, for form, for voice. Only when they've fed does Tiresias appear, the prophet who speaks what no living man should know. But Odysseus stands trembling, surrounded by the dead, unsure what he's truly called. The Greeks built places for this, the Necromancy, temples where pilgrims went below ground to summon the shades of Hades. Negotiations and the silence that followed was never total. As necromancy moved from myth into practice, it became something empires feared. The Romans in particular lived with a deep unease about witches and corpse magic. Their stories crawl with sorceresses who prowled graveyards, tore flesh from the dead, boiled bones, and bound spirits to their will. Horace warned of Canidia, the witch who dug up corpses and brewed potions from the rot. Lucan, in his epic Pharsalia, gives Erichtho, the Thessalian witch who drags a body from the battlefield, fills it with foul rites, and forces it to speak through rotting lips. Rome believed necromancy was real, and that those who practiced it could twist death itself against the living. This fear wasn't Rome's alone. In the Hebrew Bible, necromancy is condemned outright. The book of Deuteronomy doesn't leave room for interpretation. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, or who consults the dead. These were laws against transgression. The dead were off limits. Their knowledge was forbidden. To teach it was to challenge the order of creation. But even when condemned, necromancy remained. The Witch of Endor appears in the first book of Samuel. Saul, king of Israel, desperate and abandoned, begs her to raise the prophet Samuel. She does. As Samuel rises, it is a moment that breaks every law, and still, the dead answer. In this age, necromancy became two things at once, a tool of divination and a weapon. You could summon the dead for prophecy or for terror. To the Romans, it was corruption. To the Hebrews, it was rebellion. But both believed the same thing. The line between the living and the dead could break, and when it did, something always came through. By the medieval era, this was heresy. The Church named it as a crime against God, the darkest sin a soul could commit. It meant consorting with demons, wielding stolen power, and stepping outside the order of creation. Inquisitors hunted necromancers, and anyone who claimed to raise the dead was said to be deceived by Satan or working in his name. At the centre of this fear were the Grimoires, books that promised knowledge the living should never hold. The Key of Solomon, the Picatrix, others with no titles, only symbols and stains. They outlined rituals, invocations, and signs meant to compel spirits, raise the dead, or bind demons into service. These were dangerous for simply existing. To open one was to risk your soul. Some names were whispered louder than others. Gerbert of Aurillac, who became Pope Sylvester II, was said to have made pacts with demons and studied forbidden arts in secret. Roger Bacon, the English philosopher, was accused of hiding necromancy behind alchemy, and John Dee, advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, spent his life chasing lost knowledge, always shadowed by rumours that called upon more than wisdom. Necromancy, by then, was treason against heaven. Every accusation carried the same warning: raise the dead, and you risk the world unravelling with them. In Norse belief, the Draugr is a corpse that rises from its grave, swollen and stinking, with the strength of 10 men and the malice of 1. Unlike ghosts, the Draugr keeps its physical form. It walks, it kills, it guards what it was buried with, attacks the living, and spreads sickness, madness, and fear. Its grip crushes ribs, its stench chokes breath, its presence turns daylight grey. The Draugr returns when something is wrong. A man too proud to die, too greedy to let go of his treasure, too hateful to forgive his enemies. It rises from envy, vengeance, or the refusal to be forgotten. In other cases, the blame falls on improper burial, broken rituals, or curses laid before death. If a man dies with bitterness in his heart, the Norse feared he might claw back his way through the earth. Texts describe multiple kinds of Draugr. Some lie in their mounds, guarding wealth with inhuman strength. Others roam. They climb onto roofs. They shatter doors, attack livestock, cause nightmares, and if left alone, multiply. One Draugr can create more, spreading death across farms and villages like a plague with hands. Disposing of a Draugr was dangerous. It had to be physically destroyed. That meant decapitation, burning the body, scattering the ashes in the sea. Sometimes stakes were driven through the chest. Sometimes the grave was sealed with heavy stones or runes carved into the mound to trap the will inside. Corpses were tied to prevent them from walking. Doors were made narrow so spirits couldn't follow. The architecture of Viking death was shaped by the fear that it might not be permanent. But not all the dead returned to destroy. Some were brought back to serve. In Slavic and Eastern European folklore, the dead could be bound by will, raised to obey. Magic, in here, was a matter of precision, and the grave could be opened if you knew the right conditions. The upir, sometimes translated loosely as vampire, was a corpse of lingering intent. The navki, or nav, were spirits of the unbaptized, the drowned, the stillborn, liminal souls that hadn't crossed fully into death. Both were feared, but both could be used. In parts of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, it was believed that a corpse could be compelled to rise and be driven by command. Iron nails punctured through the feet, black thread wrapped around the limbs, the names of the dead whispered 3 times into the soil. If the spell was cast improperly, the corpse might be uncontrolled. but if done right, the head would carry out tasks, guarding burial mounds from thieves, watching over crossroads at night, carrying messages to the spirits beyond. In some regions, the corpse was tied to a pole or made to walk a set path around a village boundary, reinforcing a magical perimeter. In Bohemia and Moravia, there are folk tales of restless farmhands raised from the grave to finish the labour they had left undone. These corpses returned as workers, silent, tireless, voiceless. They tilled fields through the night, returned to collapsed barns, repaired fences, hauled wood. Villagers would find work completed without explanation, tools moved, soil freshly turned, and the dead, it was said, would vanish again before dawn. They weren't thanked or acknowledged, as to speak of them risked keeping them longer than intended. In medieval Germany, they called it Totenheer, the army of the dead, soldiers marching across the night sky in full formation, skeletal and silent, bound to a commander no one dared name. People claimed to hear them from a distance, the sound of weapons rattling, hooves pounding on nothing, banners flapping where there was no wind. They weren't seen often, but when they were, it meant something. War, plague, collapse. The dead didn't mobilize without cause. They were the souls of warriors denied a proper death, those who died without honor or without burial, possibly raised by sorcerers long ago, used in forgotten wars, then hidden from time. Waiting, bound by magic to rise again when called. There were places they were said to appear, mountain passes, ancient crossroads, battlefields where no grass would grow. In parts of France, the same idea took on a different form. The Menées d'Harlequin, Harlequin's host, a terrifying procession of dead riders and foot soldiers that stormed across the countryside at night. They were said to abduct the living, punish the wicked, or drag souls to the underworld. Chroniclers like Orderic Vitalis wrote of their passage as real events, witnessed by villagers who shut their doors and prayed not to be taken. In the British Isles, the belief merged into what became known as the Wild Hunt, a spectral cavalcade led by a dark figure, sometimes a god, sometimes a cursed king, sometimes the devil, and followed by a legion of the dead. The details shifted by region, but the core never changed. It was a hunt, and it moved with purpose. In parts of Wales and Cornwall, the hunt was said to rise when blood had soaked the land, as if war had shaken the bones loose. They appear in legal records, church sermons, and traveller accounts. Chroniclers like William of Newburgh wrote of corpses rising from the grave in England, attacking the living, and being exhumed, decapitated, and burned. In one 12th century case from Berwick, a man who had died of disease returned night after night to terrorize his former household. Necromancy, in this form, was rural, practical, terrifying. A way to explain why the child was wasting away, why the livestock died, why footsteps came after dark. Necromancy was a calculated act. The dead was summoned through ritual, compelled with tools, symbols, timing, and sacrifice. Preparation was everything. Grave dirt was collected from fresh burials. Bones were chosen from those who died violently, their death believed to leave a residue of power. The blood ideally came from the one performing the rite. If not, a black rooster, a lamb, or a stillborn animal might be used. These rites were mapped to the sky. Astrological alignments governed the timing, especially the hour of Saturn, ruler of death, time, and control. Grimoires detailed the planetary influences that shaped the outcome. A circle was drawn, candles were set at precise points, names were spoken, and the silence waited to break. Necromancers called the dead to speak. The goal was knowledge, secrets buried within the body. In many rituals, the spirit was trapped in a mirror, a basin of water, or the summoner's own reflection. In some, the dead were bound into smoke, into flame, or into the corpse itself, reanimated just long enough to answer. Alchemy intersected with necromancy in this search for quintessence, the purest form of spirit. It was believed the soul left a trace in the bones, and that this trace could be extracted, refined, and used. The rituals were designed to bind. It was control, and control required precision. A single misstep could end in silence, possession, or deception. Many grimoires warned that spirits lie, and that the voice answering your summons might not be the one you called. But for those who succeeded, the rewards were vast. Answers to questions no living mouth could give, knowledge hidden behind the veil, and for some, the comfort of knowing that even in death, obedience could still be forced. In the modern world, necromancy stalks boldly through the worlds we create. Fantasy seized it first. In Tolkien's Legendarium, the necromancer is Sauron in disguise, cloaked in shadow, gathering power in the ruins of Dol Guldur. In Dungeons & Dragons, necromancy is a school of magic, feared, outlawed, and endlessly tempting. It allows players to raise the dead, drain life, and bind souls. In Skyrim, a lone figure in a frozen cave can summon a skeletal army with the flick of a wrist. These games and stories tap into something older, the thrill of controlling death and the horror of what that power costs. In horror, the obsession goes deeper. Seances, Ouija boards, and ghost hunts all follow the necromantic urge. Speak with the dead, draw them near, demand they answer. The zombie born from Haitian voodoo, but twisted by Hollywood, becomes the new kind of necromantic nightmare, a horde to survive. George Romero's Night of the Living Dead turned them into icons of modern terror, stripped of personality, driven by hunger. Yet even here, the fear is the same. The dead don't stay dead, and that someone or something might be making them move. And then there are the figures who blurred the line between legend and reality. Grigory Rasputin, the Russian mystic, was feared as a man who could not die and who trafficked in powers no priest would bless. It was claimed he healed with incantations, cursed those who crossed him, and rose after every attempt on his life. He was called a prophet, a devil, a necromancer. His legend lingers because it touches that same raw nerve, the idea that death has rules and that someone has learned how to break them. The boundary between life and death is meant to be absolute, and to disturb that is a crime against the soul. Across centuries, necromancy was treated as filth, a stain, an offense to the gods and to the dead themselves. To summon a spirit is to tear it from whatever peace it found, to force memory back into bone, to make something sacred crawl, and worse, to command it with force, blood, and threat. The soul becomes a servant, the corpse a tool, and those who practice necromancy are violators, gravediggers of the spirit world, defilers of sleep. The price is never paid clean. The dead do not forget being wrenched from rest. They do not forget the summoner's voice. You can bind them, you can use them, but you cannot uncall them. Those who traffic with the dead are never alone again. Something always listens. Something always waits.